The desert night was so silent, it felt like the earth itself held its breath, and then a gunshot ripped through the darkness, echoing across the empty plains. The weary drifter, a man scarred by years of regret, tightened his grip on the revolver. The narrator said he had no name worth remembering, but they called him Jack Monroe, a ghost of the frontier. Jack Monroe said, "Another night, another bullet chasing me from the past." His shadow stretched long in the moonlight, as dust lifted with the desert wind. From the distance, coyotes howled, their cries blending with the fading thunder of the shot. Jack's eyes narrowed, not in fear but in weariness, as though the fight had long ago bled out of his spirit. His boots pressed into the dry sand, every step heavy with memory. The town loomed faintly ahead, broken signs and empty windows catching the pale moon. And though he sought nothing but rest, fate had already set its trap. The town lay before Jack Monroe, a hollow carcass of life long gone, its wooden bones groaning in the desert wind. The narrator said, it was a place forgotten, yet waiting to claim another weary soul. Jack Monroe said, looks like death still rents this place cheap. Ha! Broken saloon doors swayed with each gust, hinges screeching like a dying crow. Windows, cracked and shattered, stared like blind eyes watching his every step. Jack Monroe's boots clicked against the splintered boards of the main street, and the sound echoed too loud in the emptiness. He felt the weight of silence pressing, broken only by a faint creak from above, like something waiting to fall. Though his body screamed for rest, instinct whispered danger. His hand hovered near the revolver, and every shadow in the deserted town seemed a threat dressed in silence. Through the shifting shadows, a figure appeared on the balcony above the saloon. The narrator said, she stood with a poise too sharp for this dead place, her eyes like daggers veiled in smoke. Eleanor Kane was no ordinary survivor, but a beauty carved from fire and betrayal. Eleanor Kane said, strangers don't last long in towns like this. Jack Monroe looked up, his jaw tightening, and replied, neither do ghosts, ma'am. Her dark hair flowed in the wind, framing a face both alluring and dangerous. The lantern glow lit her features with warmth at odds with the cold night. She leaned forward, the corner of her mouth curved in a knowing smile, and Jack Monroe felt the sting of temptation that promised ruin. In that moment, her presence poisoned the silence more than any gunshot. From the alley, another figure emerged, heavy boots pounding the dirt with purpose. The narrator said, Sheriff Donovan ruled this place like a vulture over bones. Sheriff Donovan, broad and polished in clean attire, carried himself with smug authority. Sheriff Donovan said, you best keep moving, Drifter. We don't need more trouble. Jack Monroe's eyes narrowed as he replied, trouble usually finds me first. Donovan's badge gleamed in the pale moonlight, but the gleam in his eyes was colder still. His presence pressed against Jack Monroe, not as a protector but as a predator cloaked in law. Around them, the town seemed to shrink tighter, every boarded door and shuttered window complicit in silence. Jack Monroe knew at once this was no man of justice but a shadow feeding on the weak. From a rocking chair on the porch of the general store, an older man lit his pipe, his eyes watching with grim patience. The narrator said, Ezra Holt, once a gunslinger, now the ghost of his own past. Ezra Holt spoke with gravel in his voice. Town don't take kindly to men like you, Jack Monroe, but maybe it needs one. Jack Monroe's hand eased from his revolver as he looked at the elder. Jack Monroe said, I came here for quiet, not another fight. Ezra Holt exhaled smoke that drifted like old memories. He replied, quiet's been dead here longer than you've been running, son. The wind pushed harder through the empty street, and the faint creak of wood carried like a warning. Ezra Holt's gaze narrowed, as though he already knew blood would write the next chapter of this town's story. Jack Monroe woke with a start, his body slumped against a broken bench in the empty saloon. The narrator said, sleep offered no peace, only nightmares dressed as memory. In his dream, the faces of men he had gunned down swam before him, mouths open but silent. Jack Monroe muttered, I never asked for forgiveness, but I keep hearing their screams. His fingers brushed over the revolver in his lap, as though it held both comfort and damnation. Moonlight cut through a shattered window, falling on his worn face like the hand of judgment. The creak of a loose board snapped him back to the present, and his eyes darted toward the sound. Jack Monroe said, "Ghosts don't stay in dreams, they follow you everywhere." He leaned forward, rubbing tired eyes, and the silence pressed heavy once more, reminding him the line between memory and reality was too thin. At dawn, Jack Monroe stepped outside, the ghost town painted gold by rising sun. The narrator said, "Light revealed not peace, but the scars of a place left to rot." A young man approached, boots clumsy against the dirt. This was Tom Walker, a boy of 19, eager fire in his eyes. Tom Walker said, "You the one they call Monroe? Folks whisper your name like thunder." Jack Monroe studied him, weary eyes narrowing. Jack Monroe said, "Whispers are nothing but wind, boy. Stay out of it." Tom Walker grinned, his youthful energy unbroken, and added, "I've waited my whole life for someone to stand up to Donovan." Jack Monroe turned away, muttering, "Then you'll die quicker than you lived." Yet deep inside, he envied the boy's hope, even as his own had long ago dried up in the dust. Later that morning, Jack Monroe found Eleanor Kane waiting by the saloon doors, her presence as sharp as the desert sun. The narrator said, she carried beauty like a loaded gun, both temptation and danger. Eleanor Kane said, "You look tired, Jack. Maybe I could ease that weight." Jack Monroe's jaw tightened, and he replied, "The last woman who tried near broke me in two." Her lips curved into a smile that promised both salvation and ruin. She stepped closer, her perfume faint but cutting through dust and whiskey. Eleanor Kane whispered, "I could help you survive Donovan, if you trust me." Jack Monroe's eyes hardened, and he muttered, "Trust is poison in towns like this." Yet despite his words, his gaze lingered too long, and in that silence, fate drew them closer to betrayal. Ezra Holt leaned against the porch rail, pipe smoke curling in the morning light. The narrator said, he was the last voice of wisdom in a town choking on silence. Ezra Holt said, "You're dragging fire into a place that's already ash, Jack." Jack Monroe lowered his gaze, replying, "I just wanted to rest, Ezra. That's all." Ezra Holt exhaled slowly, smoke drifting between them like ghosts of the past. He said, "Men like you don't rest. You burn until nothing's left." Jack Monroe turned away, but the words sank deep, cutting sharper than a blade. Tom Walker, standing nearby, added eagerly, "Then let him burn bright enough to light this town." Jack Monroe shot the boy a weary look, muttering, "Careful, boy, flames don't just light, they consume." The moment hung heavy, like judgment waiting in the dust. The silence of the street broke with the sound of polished boots striking wood. Sheriff Donovan appeared, his clean coat and shining badge, mocking the dust around him. The narrator said, he was law twisted into tyranny, authority wrapped in greed. Sheriff Donovan said, "I warned you, Monroe. Best leave before this place swallows you whole." Jack Monroe stared him down, revolver still at his hip. Jack Monroe said, "Funny thing about being swallowed, Sheriff. Sometimes a man bites back." Donovan's smirk widened, cold and unshaken. Eleanor Kane lingered in the doorway, her eyes flicking between both men, her loyalty cloaked in mystery. Tom Walker clenched his fists, whispering, "This town needs change." Ezra Holt muttered, "Change costs blood, boy." The tension built, and the dusty street itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first move. The morning sun burned hotter as Sheriff Donovan stepped into the street, his badge catching the light like a blade. The narrator said, "Law had no mercy here, only a mask worn by corruption." Sheriff Donovan said, "Time's up, Monroe. Leave or I'll drag you out." Jack Monroe stood tall, though his body ached with exhaustion, his revolver heavy at his side. Jack Monroe said, "I've been dragged before, Sheriff, but I don't scare easy." The townsfolk peeked from behind cracked shutters, afraid to breathe too loudly. Tom Walker clenched his fists, whispering, "Donovan fears him, I can see it." Ezra Holt puffed his pipe, muttering, "Fear don't stop bullets, boy." The dust swirled in the growing heat, and the standoff tightened. Jack Monroe felt the town watching, its silence demanding he make a choice, one that could ignite fire from ashes. Later in the dim corner of the saloon, Eleanor Kane leaned close, her eyes dark with secrets. The narrator said, her words flowed like honey, sweet, until the sting revealed the venom. Eleanor Kane said, "Donovan isn't the only one to fear. This town hides things even worse." Jack Monroe studied her, suspicion etched in every line of his face. Jack Monroe said, "You talk in riddles, lady. Spit it straight or leave me to my drink." She smiled faintly, tilting her head with calculated grace. Eleanor Kane whispered, "Donovan's men are planning a strike. They'll crush you before sundown." Jack Monroe's grip tightened on his glass, his jaw rigid. He muttered, "And yet you're telling me this knowing he'll hang you for treachery." Her lips curved, dangerous and inviting. Eleanor Kane replied, "Maybe I like watching men gamble their lives." The saloon doors burst open as two hired thugs stormed in, rifles raised. The narrator said, "Violence came swift, the hand of Donovan reaching to snuff rebellion." Tom Walker rushed forward without thinking, fists clenched, his youth betraying his caution. Jack Monroe shouted, "Tom, stand back!" But the boy lunged, catching one thug by surprise. The scuffle broke into chaos, tables splintering under boots. Jack Monroe drew his revolver with a swift motion, firing a shot that shattered a bottle and grazed an attacker. Eleanor Kane stood frozen in the corner, her face unreadable, torn between fear and fascination. Ezra Holt kicked open the door from outside, shouting, "Damn fools, you'll bring the whole town down!" Smoke and dust filled the saloon, the air thick with heat and fury. Tom Walker said, "I won't back down, not now." Sheriff Donovan stood in the street, his men tightening their hold on the town. The narrator said, "He ruled with fear, every shadow bending to his will." Sheriff Donovan shouted, "Lock the doors, drag out the drifters' friends, make an example of them." His cold voice carried across the square, silencing what little life remained. Jack Monroe stepped from the saloon, revolver steady, dust clinging to his coat. Jack Monroe said, "You'll have to bleed me dry before you take another soul." The townsfolk froze, torn between terror and hope, their eyes fixed on the man who dared to speak back. Eleanor Kane slipped into the street behind Jack, her gaze unreadable. Tom Walker stood at his side, fists clenched, while Ezra Holt muttered, "This is the storm I warned of." The weight of violence pressed down, heavy as the sun above. That night, as firelight flickered through broken windows, Ezra Holt gathered them in the quiet of the store. The narrator said, "Wisdom carried no comfort, only the weight of truth." Ezra Holt said, "Storm's coming fast, and no man can stop it alone." Jack Monroe leaned back, revolver across his knees, eyes shadowed with fatigue. Jack Monroe muttered, "I never came to fight, Ezra, but damned if I'll run again." Tom Walker's voice cracked with conviction. "We can fight together, Jack. Donovan bleeds like any man." Eleanor Kane lit a lantern, her gaze shifting with hidden thoughts. She whispered, "Careful. Hope makes men blind to betrayal." Jack Monroe turned sharply, his stare pinning her with suspicion. The old man sighed, smoke curling from his pipe. Ezra Holt said, "Hope may blind, but despair kills quicker." The night grew heavy as Eleanor Kane sat by the saloon's cracked mirror, her face half lost in shadow. The narrator said, "Her beauty was carved from sorrow, her truth buried beneath layers of deceit." Eleanor Kane whispered, "I was once a girl with hope, Jack, before Donovan chained me to this town." Jack Monroe leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes dark with suspicion. Jack Monroe said, "Chains or not, you've worn betrayal like a dress." She flinched, her lips trembling between anger and regret. Eleanor Kane replied, "I never wanted this life, but survival is a cruel teacher." The silence grew thick, the sound of her dress brushing the floor louder than words. Jack Monroe muttered, "Truth don't wash clean, not even in tears." And yet, for a brief moment, sorrow softened the sharpness in her gaze. In the alley behind the saloon, Tom Walker paced restlessly, fists clenched in anger. The narrator said, "Youth burned with a fire that knew little of patience." Tom Walker said, "We can't wait, Jack. Donovan's men are striking first. We must hit them before they crush us." Jack Monroe stepped out from the shadows, his voice low and steady. Jack Monroe said, "A boy's rush gets men killed quicker than bullets." Tom Walker glared, his face bright with defiance. Tom Walker replied, "Then let me die standing instead of hiding." Ezra Holt appeared at the end of the alley, pipe smoke curling in the cold air. Ezra Holt said foolish courage is just another word for a grave. Yet even in his warning, a flicker of pride softened his gaze, knowing the boy's heart was unyielding. Sheriff Donovan gathered his deputies in the sheriff's office, the lamplight glinting off polished rifles stacked against the wall. The narrator said, "Law twisted into tyranny and fear dressed as order." Sheriff Donovan said, "We strike tonight. We'll gut Monroe before the town grows brave." One deputy shifted uneasily, but Donovan's glare silenced him. Eleanor Kane slipped quietly through the back door, her eyes catching the plan scrawled on the desk. The sheriff smirked, sensing her hesitation. Sheriff Donovan said, "Careful, Eleanor. Traitors don't last long." Her lips curved into a forced smile, masking the storm within. Eleanor Kane whispered, "I only follow strength, Sheriff, and you're the strongest here." But in her eyes doubt flickered, fragile yet dangerous. That evening, gunfire broke the silence of the street as Donovan's men launched their ambush. The narrator said, "Violence came not like a storm but like a blade, swift and merciless." Jack Monroe staggered as a bullet grazed his arm, blood soaking his sleeve. Jack Monroe growled, "So this is the welcome I get." Tom Walker fired back wildly, his hands shaking but his spirit unbroken. Ezra Holt dragged the boy behind a trough, muttering, "Keep your head low, damn fool." Eleanor Kane appeared in the shadows, torn between fleeing and aiding them. Smoke filled the air, the saloon doors shuddering under the roar of bullets. The night screamed with chaos, and every heartbeat promised death. Later, under dim lamplight inside the store, Ezra Holt tended to Jack Monroe's wound with rough hands. The narrator said, "The wisdom of the old carried the weight of blood, not mercy." Ezra Holt said, "You'll live, but scars don't fade, boy." Jack Monroe winced, muttering, "I've carried scars longer than peace." Tom Walker sat nearby, guilt etched into his young face. Tom Walker said, "If I'd listened, maybe you wouldn't be bleeding." Jack Monroe looked at him with steady eyes. Jack Monroe said, "Don't carry blame, kid. Just carry the fight smarter next time." Eleanor Kane stood apart, her gaze distant, as if her soul wrestled with demons no one else could see. The silence stretched, heavy with truths unspoken, and only the flicker of lamplight bore witness to their weary resolve. The night was restless as Tom Walker searched through the sheriff's desk, desperation driving his hands. The narrator said the young find truth by accident, often bleeding for it. Tom Walker found papers marked with Donovan's seal, names of men paid to kill Monroe. His breath quickened, and he whispered, "He's buying the whole damn town." Jack Monroe entered, his shadow tall against the lantern glow. Jack Monroe said, "What did you find, boy?" Tom Walker's voice cracked, "It's worse than you thought. Donovan's not alone. Someone close is feeding him every step we take." The weight of betrayal hung thick, and Ezra Holt muttered from the corner, "A traitor's knife cuts deeper than any bullet." The boy's face paled, fear shaking his resolve. In the saloon, Eleanor Kane stood by the window, moonlight bathing her in pale silver. The narrator said, "Beauty became a weapon, her silence sharper than steel." Jack Monroe confronted her, eyes burning with suspicion. Jack Monroe said, "Tell me why Donovan knows our every move." Eleanor Kane's lips curled in a half-smile, bitter and haunting. Eleanor Kane whispered, "Because I showed him. Because survival demanded it." Jack Monroe stepped back, his chest tightening like a wound torn open. Jack Monroe said, "You've been poisoning me since the first word." Her eyes flickered with both sorrow and defiance, and she whispered, "And still you wanted me near." The silence cracked like glass, every truth shattering between them. The air thickened as Eleanor Kane stepped closer, her eyes glistening like storm clouds. The narrator said, "Her kiss was sweeter than wine, a weapon dressed as desire." She leaned in, brushing her lips against Jack Monroe's. A fleeting taste of heaven turned poison. Jack Monroe froze, torn between rage and longing, his hand trembling near the revolver. Eleanor Kane whispered, "You'll remember me longer than you'll hate me." Jack Monroe's jaw tightened and he muttered, "You've damned us all." Her smile curved faint, both cruel and broken. Tom Walker burst through the door shouting, "Jack, she's with Donovan." The silence shattered, betrayal now carved in stone. Sheriff Donovan strode into the saloon with a smirk, his men at his back. The narrator said, victory dripped from his lips like venom. Sheriff Donovan said, "Even ghosts fall when kissed by poison." Jack Monroe's chest heaved, rage boiling under weariness. Eleanor Kane lowered her gaze, her beauty dimmed by shame. Tom Walker stepped forward, fists trembling. Tom Walker said, "You'll pay for this, Sheriff." Donovan laughed coldly, his hand resting on the polished revolver at his belt. Sheriff Donovan said, "Boys die fast when they speak too loud." Ezra Holt entered, pipe clenched, his eyes steel. Ezra Holt said, "Not all old dogs forget how to bite." Tension coiled tight, death looming in every breath. Ezra Holt stepped forward, his voice rough with truth. The narrator said, "Old ghosts carry secrets sharp enough to wound the present." Ezra Holt said, "Donovan's wealth ain't from law. It's blood money from the mines, stolen from men buried without graves." Sheriff Donovan sneered, his eyes flashing cold. Jack Monroe muttered, "So that's the root of your kingdom, bones and gold." Tom Walker's face blazed with fury, shouting, "You killed my father, didn't you?" Donovan's silence was the only confession. Eleanor Kane turned away, her eyes wet with conflict, yet chains of guilt bound her still. Jack Monroe raised his revolver, voice low and steady. Jack Monroe said, "Your empire ends tonight, Sheriff." The room felt like a noose tightening, ready to snap. The dawn broke red as blood across the sky while Tom Walker stood with rifle clutched in trembling hands. The narrator said, "Youth stood at the edge of manhood, tested by fire and fear." Tom Walker said, "Jack, we can't wait. They're coming now." Jack Monroe, his face pale from sleepless nights and wounds, rested his revolver across his thigh. Jack Monroe said, "A fight finds you when it's ready, boy, not before." Ezra Holt leaned heavily on the porch rail, pipe smoke curling from lips lined with regret. Ezra Holt said, "If death knocks, better greet him standing than cowering." Eleanor Kane appeared in the doorway, eyes dark, torn between love and guilt. The silence trembled like a bowstring as the first hoofbeats thundered in the distance. The riders came hard, Donovan's men filling the street like a tide of dust and steel. The narrator said, "Fear took form on horseback, cruelty riding with it." Sheriff Donovan led the charge, silver badge flashing in morning light. Sheriff Donovan shouted, "Bring me Monroe's head." Jack Monroe stepped into the street, his coat whipping in the wind. Jack Monroe said, "You'll have to earn it with your blood." Tom Walker fired the first shot, the echo cracking the dawn. Ezra Holt muttered, "Hell's broken loose again," and lifted his old rifle with steady aim. Eleanor Kane watched from behind, her lips trembling as though bound between loyalty and doom. The street erupted in chaos, bullets tearing through silence. Gunfire thundered as Jack Monroe dove behind a trough, firing back with steady hands. The narrator said, "The drifter's soul burned brightest when cornered, a man defined by the fire he could not escape." Bullets split wood, spraying splinters across his face. Tom Walker ducked beside him shouting, "We've got them pinned." Ezra Holt stood tall, despite his limp, his rifle cracking with deadly precision. Ezra Holt said, "Old hands don't shake when it matters most." Sheriff Donovan barked orders, his men circling like wolves. Eleanor Kane ran into the open, screaming, "Stop this madness!" Her voice drowned in the roar of guns, her figure lit by dust and flame. Jack Monroe growled. There's no stopping it now. The riders fell, one after another, but Donovan strode forward like a dark storm. The narrator said, corruption wore a badge, and its arrogance would not bend. Sheriff Donovan shouted, you can't fight the law, Monroe. The law is me. Jack Monroe stood in the center of the street, revolver steady, blood dripping from his sleeve. Jack Monroe said, law don't wear your face, Donovan. Justice does. The crowd of townsfolk gathered, their fear turning to hope as they watched the two men circle. Tom Walker clenched his fists, whispering, this is it. Ezra Holt muttered, high noon, as it always ends. Eleanor Kane's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as she whispered, forgive me, Jack. The air stood still, time waiting for the draw. The gun spoke as one, thunder splitting the noon air. The narrator said, every story bleeds to its peak, where men stand naked before fate. Donovan fired first, his bullet grazing Jack's side. Jack Monroe staggered but returned fire, his shot tearing into Donovan's chest. The sheriff gasped, his badge glinting one final time before he fell into the dust. Eleanor Kane cried out, rushing forward, her hands trembling as she touched the fallen lawman. Tom Walker shouted, it's over, but Ezra Holt muttered, nothing's ever over, boy. Only quieter. Jack Monroe fell to one knee, blood seeping from his side, eyes locked on Eleanor Kane as though she were both curse and salvation. The silence rang louder than the guns, a silence that felt eternal. The town stood still, as Sheriff Donovan's body lay in the dust, the echo of gunfire fading into memory. The narrator said, a kingdom built on bones had crumbled with a single shot. Jack Monroe staggered, blood dripping from his wound, his face pale, yet unyielding. Tom Walker raised his rifle in shaky triumph, shouting, the town is free. Ezra Holt muttered, freedom don't come clean, boy. It's bought with ghosts. The townsfolk crept from their doors, their eyes wide with fragile hope. Eleanor Kane knelt beside Donovan's corpse, tears streaking her face as she whispered, I never wanted this end. Jack Monroe's gaze lingered on her, sorrow etched deep, for love and betrayal wore the same face. Later, inside the battered saloon, the survivors gathered in silence. The narrator said, victory tasted bitter, for death was its only seasoning. Jack Monroe leaned against the bar, clutching his side. Jack Monroe said, Donovan's gone, but the blood he spilled won't dry easy. Tom Walker slammed his fist against the wood. Tom Walker said, we can rebuild, we must. Ezra Holt exhaled smoke, his voice low. Ezra Holt said, rebuilding means burying first. Eleanor Kane stood apart, her face pale, voice trembling. Eleanor Kane whispered, every choice I made shackled me tighter to him. Maybe now I am free, or maybe I am nothing. The silence wrapped around them, each word heavy with loss. By evening, the townsfolk buried Donovan in shallow earth beyond the ridge, no prayers spoken. The narrator said, even tyrants find rest in dust, though their sins linger. Jack Monroe watched in silence, his breath heavy, his wound stitched roughly. Tom Walker said, he'll never rule another man. Ezra Holt muttered, but his shadow will haunt every step we take. Eleanor Kane placed a single wilted flower on the grave, her hands trembling. She whispered, forgive me, Jack, for every lie I wrapped in a smile. Jack Monroe turned away, his eyes sharp with sorrow. Jack Monroe said, some lies buried deeper than bodies. The wind howled through the barren ridge, carrying the weight of unfinished reckonings. The next morning, Tom Walker stood tall on the street, his youth hardened by fire. The narrator said, the boy became a man, forged by dust and death. Tom Walker said, we'll make this place live again, Jack, I swear it. Jack Monroe met his gaze, weary eyes softening for the first time. Jack Monroe said, maybe you'll succeed where I failed. Ezra Holt leaned on his cane, smoke curling from his pipe. Ezra Holt said, the town don't need ghosts, it needs men who ain't afraid to bleed for it. Eleanor Kane looked at them, her eyes filled with regret. Eleanor Kane whispered. And what of women who have only known how to betray? Jack Monroe's voice was low, but steady. Jack Monroe said, even poison flowers can grow again if given light. As the sun dipped low, Jack Monroe walked alone down the desert road, his shadow long against the sand. The narrator said, every drifter leaves, for peace is not theirs to keep. Eleanor Kane watched from the saloon doorway, her hand pressed to her lips, eyes wet with regret. Tom Walker called out, stay Jack, we need you. Jack Monroe turned slightly, his gaze heavy with memories. Jack Monroe said, I've given all I had. What's left is yours. Ezra Holt muttered, a man can't outrun himself, son. But maybe he can outlast the pain. Jack tipped his hat, his figure fading into the horizon. The narrator said, her kiss lingered still, sweeter than wine, deadlier than poison, a memory that would follow him into every sunset.